Here's where your comment about a lawsuit might be central. At the moment, bleak. Resources diminished, public advocacy almost non-existent, training poor, homogenized, and certainly resources, economic and otherwise, extremely lower than I've had in years. Just keeps. I'm not. Well, Bill Moore said actually at a presentation, keynote speech in 1988 in Kansas City, it's a bad time to be a kid. Well, that was in 1988. I'm thinking maybe if Bill was still with us today, he would say that same thing. I'm hopeful through the work that you guys are doing, preserving some of this history, that the vision and the knowledge base that we've actually invested a lot in will continue to be an inspiration for the future. I don't think that it's appropriate that special education, for example, would and should, as it probably did through much of the 80s, 70s, and 80s, take the lead and almost exclusionary role with mental health needs for kids. I mean, if it wasn't for special education, the EBD population would have gotten pretty much nothing, except if you were white and from families of resources who took advantage of community mental health. I think the future has to be an integration of mental health services and resources and educational resources, and hopefully blending into that framework. We need juvenile justice for lots of issues, but one which I'm hoping will become more recommitted to a habilitative approach. It could be a very good future, where nobody has massive resources, but our resources collectively could be applied in a much more meaningful way, and even a much more powerful way. If having less resources means we use them better, we use them more smartly, and we make sure the kids who get help, who need help, get it. And I'm a big fan of Eli Bauer's diagnostic model. You know, he said we only have two kinds of kids. Not all of the different categories. We have kids who need help and kids who don't. That's what Eli said. I think Eli was right. The question is, are we as a society willing to invest in the kids who need help? That's a political question. That's a social issues question. At the moment, I'm concerned about that one.
What advice would you offer to those just entering into the field? And that can be the field as a practitioner or into higher education.
To me, it's get connected, stay connected. Go join an organization, and go to conferences, go to meetings, network, talk to anybody, meet anybody, stay involved with it, because that's your lifeline. I've always enjoyed the fact that throughout my career I've had friends from one coast to the other that I could talk to at a moment, or from even in foreign countries. Choosing not to be isolated, choosing not to stay at home has meant that I've had a wonderful career.
Great advice. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. The experience, in this business of having relationships, having face-to-face conversations, having group kind of interactions and discussions, the absence of those experiences and this online stuff, that's very troubling to me. But one of them that I used to be able to do, and I don't know how you would do this in an online course, was to go to grand rounds with psychiatrists. And there would be a kid, and the whole hospital staff would be there, and this kid would be the focus, and everybody would do their presentation from their different perspectives of their experience with this issue, and they would share what they collectively thought made sense for an intervention plan, and they would come up with a treatment plan. Brand Brown's is a model that makes a whole lot of sense to me for dealing with really difficult kids. Education doesn't even do that, but I think they should. Because it's a way of really truly getting the best input you can from everybody who has some experience with the youngster who's presenting a lot of, and that was an illustration of, I said earlier that medicine is giving me some different ideas about how we do training, only because I think we count on them to get it right. That doesn't mean they always do. And then it seems like education is looking for a short circuit somewhere, which is, instead of, does that make any sense to you?
Sure. The one thing I just thought of was Monday morning, from the medical model, the morbidity meeting, where when something goes terribly wrong in a medical field, they have a procedure in place where your peers, in a non-accusatory fashion, dissect the situation so it doesn't happen again. And how many times, what do we do in education when it goes terribly wrong? And we close the door and close the file and hope nobody sues.
Yeah.
And so we're in some ways damned to repeat that same kind of model. So that's intriguing, that kind of medical model.
Well, and the other experiences that I've had where my son, who's now a young adult, but he had a heart condition that he wasn't diagnosed until he was a teenager, and we were fortunate to live in Minnesota and only an hour away from Mayo, and all of a sudden found ourselves in the cardiac unit at Mayo Clinic, which is an interesting place. I often say to people, if you've never been there, it's a field trip you should take. It's amazing the way that place is set up. But just that one unit, the cardiology unit, has, at that time, 57 cardiologists.
Mm-hmm.
And none of them work alone. They all work in teams. You may have your primary doctor, but behind the scenes, after that person is doing whatever, they have their own in-house consulting model where they compare notes. While this is specialists working together with specialists, make sure that whatever they do takes advantage of their collective wisdom. Now that is genuine expertise.
Mm-hmm.
And when I'm looking at, if you look at our outcome data on troubled kids, we're not even close to anything like that. But in terms of social costs, what does it cost us as a society not to use our best expertise? Every one of these kids who becomes a tax consumer rather than a taxpayer. I mean, this is just what my dad used to call penny wise and dollar foolish.
Mm-hmm.
Not to invest the resources in upfront early intervention, and even with our most challenging kids, the best that we can give them.
He used to call the cops when they go off.
Yes, and this insanity, which is well documented now, it's even the prison, school to prison pipeline and stuff, which I've been collecting data on forever. I mean, it is social stupidity, really. So I don't know, and frankly, to come to a conference such as this one or others, we can sit around and I have a phrase which I use for admire the problem, but what are you going to go home and do about it?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Because I think that the problem has been there for a long time, or forever.
Yeah.
At a certain point, we were engaged in finding a solution, and I think in some ways, we're still engaged in finding a solution. It's just a much simpler, and in some quarters, I think, much more
We look to
efficient.
the least common denominator.
Yeah, which is, if a kid goes off, dial 911, let the cops pick them up.
Mm-hmm.
Let the least trained that have been trained in brute force, or massive brute force is the way to solve a problem. If that were the case, the problem wouldn't exist.
Well, we just had a series of newspaper articles in the Minneapolis paper, major paper there, about how, now we're talking about the adult world, not the kid world. The criminal justice system is the default mental health
Yeah, it is.
resource.
There was,
And it's insane, obviously, that none of it makes sense, but it is. And the police officers are in a single and I used to know quite a few police officers who got into the business because they wanted to be mental health workers. That is not what these guys started
No.
to do. That's not at all what they're interested in.
Warm fuzzies are not really in the academy
they're
training program.
trained differently. They're trained to take no guff from anyone. And I remember many occasions when we would have to, with a lot of reticence, send kids in squad cars to be arrested. There were times we sent social workers along to make sure that those kids weren't abused in the squad car.
Right.
These cops weren't going to take anything from those kids, and we did, in fact, send staff along to make sure they didn't get hurt en route to jail. But so I don't see that as. I think we've become a society that basically says, well, this is just the way it is, and we're not going to invest anything more in containment and control. Now, I like to characterize it, sadly, as a culture which during the late 80s and into the early 90s, there was a period of time there between, I would say, 86, 87 and up to 93, 94, where the country was very attentive to extraordinarily high levels of youth aggression, youth violence in the country. And then that's, in fact, when it peaked. And when you're a country that documents that on TV every night or on the front page of the newspaper, rather than the kids who are succeeding, eventually, and this is my own kind of assessment of what happened, you become a society in which the adults become afraid of their own children. When that happens, the relationship is significantly altered from one of nourishment and development to one of control. And when control is the defining attribute in the adult-child relationship, it's never good.
No, it never.
Not in terms of long-term outcomes. So I think and that's what happened in the juvenile justice world. The habilitative model of the 70s and into the early 80s was replaced with the public safety model in the Safe Schools Act of 93, which meant the goal of that whole sector of, quote, service was public safety, which is to keep the kids off the street. It wasn't what you did 2 or 4 kids, it was what you did to keep them away from the rest of us. That's a fear or control-based cultural, and we're still living with that. Sandy Hook just accentuated it.
Yep.
Yeah.
But we're putting that on the back burner now.
Yeah, you really kind of wonder what will the nexus be that forces us to stop admiring the problem and start dealing us being society.
But us being us too.
Yeah.
I mean,
But when you mentioned Sandy Hook, you always think, what could be worse than a shooting? When you go to a late night first showing of a first run film, and your loved one comes home in a body bag. What could be worse than that? Well, we now know the answer to that. So the next question is, what could be worse than Sandy Hook? And I'm afraid that we're going to sit and wait and find out.
well, I mean, how many acts of violence using guns have happened since even Sandy Hook? I mean,
Yeah, and I think there are several significant differences. One, the age of the victims at Sandy Hook, and one, the fact that they all occurred at the same time. But that's not, as you said, we've gotten used to that. The only reason that made the news is because it was unique. But the number of fatalities, the age of fatalities, that happens every day and has for years. And you're right, we've got used to that certain level of violence is just kind of background noise.
Well, I tell a story often when I do violence intervention training stuff, that we all, back in the era of Columbine, were so upset about the number of kids that died in Columbine. And that was, of course, big news even today.
Sure.
Yeah.
What you don't hear is that in the 2 weeks following Columbine, the same number of kids were killed in Baltimore, one school district. Same number of kids, just one at a time instead of all at once. And that never got in any newspaper.
Yeah, because it's old news.
Yes.
It's not unique enough. And I think the other part, and we've talked some about online and connectedness, the other thing that kind of encourages that is now we can hunt worldwide for that unique story. It used to be more regional or even local, that if something happened in Minneapolis, I in Kansas City would never know about it, unless it was something very unique. And now it's to search for the uniqueness. I may not know about what happened in Kansas City.
But I know that in Dar es Salaam, X, Y,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
Z happened.
yeah, it doesn't even have to have national borders.
Yeah.
You know, it's for that unique news story, and because of the efficiency factor, you know, we want to do the national news in 7 minutes. It's only going to be those top of those kind of outlandish, unique stories that ever get any in depth. So that doesn't surprise me.
God, I'm getting more and more depressed.
Yeah, I wonder what time the, oh, wait a minute.
Well, you know, there is some raise. I'm not sure what the characterization is. I mean, there are some organizations who do some really good stuff, and they just don't get the kind of attention or support. But the Children's Defense Fund,
Yeah,
Mhm.
amazingly,
yeah,
amazing organization and what they're on top of. It's just, and the Annie Casey Foundation.
Yes.
Amazing.
Oh, and they just had a great piece come out on children with disabilities.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, there are organizations who are doing some truly wonderful
Mhm.
work, and you know, I don't know. I post all that stuff when I can on our own webpage or on our own Facebook page. But who reads that? You know, besides me and a few other people, and who? Yeah, I mean, there's not enough people who. If you take the collective knowledge of what's being done in organizations like those two and others, there's an awful lot of media knowledge available that it's been tested, if you will, that could and should become part of not only an educational framework or mental health, but community development models and public policing and community reform and all of those different vehicles of people that have a common interest in this place we all live. And that, to me, we were just talking about if you've got 7 minutes to get all this stuff in, they will never make the news. But they're the ones who, if they were the news on a daily basis, maybe we would have some pretty encouraging things to look forward to, but they're not.
You know, when you were saying that, I was trying to think who. My father passed away about a year ago, but I spent a lot of time over the last several years in the care home, and you know, of course, when you're 90, you sleep a lot, or 95, and so he'd be asleep, and I'd talk to these others, residents, and one of them said something about it that kind of resonated when you were talking, and it had to do with how you live your life, and his comment had to do with track. He was an ex-track star, and he said there were sprinters and there are long-distance runners. And if you think about what a sprinter does, it's very flashy, and it's very fast, and it's very short. And that's what he said is, you know, we've become a nation of sprinters. We have to have something that makes the 6 o'clock news, and then we can go on to the next thing. Long-distance runners have no audience.
Yeah.